Good morning, Alison Strang. Alison Strang could not be with us physically today due to transport strikes. She's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Health and Development of Queen Margaret University. In 2008, Dr. Strang developed the Indicators of Integration Framework and then co-authored their update for the Home Office recently. Alison Strang is also a member of Focus Advisory Board, and in this capacity she will give us a keynote on research perspective on dynamic integration. Alison, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind welcome. It's great to be with you, and I'm really sorry not to be with you in person, because I do believe this is a very important event, because it's the culmination of a huge amount of work, and I love that video. Well done, Focus team, and thank you for that. I hope I'll get to see that again. I thought it was an excellent communication tool. So I think we're all here because we do believe this is a hugely important area of work. So I thought I'd start with just a quick reflection on what is so important about what we do. So if we could look at the slides, maybe you're already looking at the slides, but I'm not. Oh yes, great. Okay, hopefully you can see them. So let's have a look at that first slide and just remind ourselves of migration trends. As IOM helpfully keeps us up to date with migration trends, we can see, if you look at that table on the right, if it's on your right, that migration is going up dramatically in all parts of the world, and more in some than others, notably Asia and Europe. But migration for the last 30 years, that's 1990 to 2020, is rising exponentially from one country to another, international migration. So let's go on to the next slide, which focuses in on forced displacement rather than migration in general. I can hear a bit of an echo. Can other people? Is that a problem, or are we fine? Maybe we're fine. So forced displacement, UNHCR figures, up-to-date ones here, the 2021 figures. 84 million people forcibly displaced worldwide by 2021, and we know that 48 million of those were internally displaced, and the others were externally displaced in different ways, and that figure of 26.6 million is the figure that we're familiar with on refugees. And it's easy for these mind-blowing figures to kind of settle and us get used to them, but if we go on to the next slide, I think it's quite a helpful one. It's a year earlier, but nevertheless, UNHCR point out 1 in every 95 people on Earth has fled their home as a result of conflict or persecution, and to me that really brings it into focus very powerfully. So we know that this is a huge issue. This is the way the world is for us these days, and I suppose I wanted to start there, because that's the world that I believe most of us are working in. And if we go on to the next slide, even now we are in the middle of a new, dare I say it, refugee crisis. And as was pointed out earlier, this is not new. We have been around this loop so many times, and interestingly, and I don't know what your experiences are in your own context, but my understanding is across Europe we're in another wave of compassion and welcome. But as we're probably also all very aware, that compassion and welcome doesn't always last, and that over time there becomes more of a sense of threat and suspicion and fear. And I guess that's what we're wanting to explore in our work on integration. So if we could go on to the next slide. that's the question really. Why is migration seen as a threat? And just in a very broad brush way, in the next flick, I would observe one of the key threats, perceived threats, is pressure on resources. That fear that there are too many people in a particular context, we can't afford to support them. And the next point, Christiana, thank you. I would say that another big issue is the fear of the erosion of culture, that people coming in with different cultural norms, different ways of life will threaten our way of life and our culture. And then finally, the fear that this will lead to social tension and disrupt social cohesion and create instability. So I just put those up as kind of crude, broad headlines to illustrate the world that I guess many of us have been working in as we address integration. So, as we said, we've been looking at this for a long time. If we go on to the next slide, there has been integration research for a long time. Way back in 1998, Robinson famously said, I think here in Brussels, with you in Brussels actually, that integration is a vague and chaotic concept, really slippery, really difficult to grasp. And that was back in 1998. Sadly, almost a quarter of a century later, I'm not sure that we could really disagree with that statement, but we're still working on it. So when I first got involved in this area of work, I would be able to characterize the research on integration as being kind of primarily from three perspectives. The dominant one being social policy, looking at economic considerations and social cohesion as being one of the kind of driver questions. So a very top-down perspective on exploring and understanding integration. But also in parallel, but not necessarily in collaboration, is a body of research around the individual, and that would look at individual adjustment and acculturation, but also very much the therapeutic response to, in the case of refugees, to the experience of trauma. And so that has been a strong theme in integration research, is how are refugees affected by trauma and how does that impact on their settling in a new context. And then the third main theme, which again, I think for a long time has been operating very separately, sadly, would be humanitarian response. And there we have, let me say, this is changing very positively, I think, over time, but it was a very sort of compassion-driven model of vulnerability and how we respond to vulnerability. But gradually, as with each of these three, that's been changing and taking a more holistic approach. So, if we could go on to the next slide, I was just going to talk a little bit about the work that we were called to do way back at the sort of 2002 era to look at integration, trying to tackle this problem of this chaotic and slippery concept. And we were commissioned, and I think this is an important point, our original research was commissioned by government to support the measurement, actually, of integration interventions. And it's so interesting, isn't it? And maybe this is something we could talk about, the interactions between academia and policy and practice too, and how we shape what one another does. But as we at Queen Margaret University took on that task of looking at integration, we were very aware of those three major areas of relevant research, but were very keen to take a holistic approach to studying integration. And so we made sure that we had a research program, a bit like Focus really, that had these different arms to it. So we were looking at academic and policy literature to look at what were the concepts that people are dealing with, how people are describing and understanding integration, but also learning from practitioners and what people are actually doing and what works. And then at the time, the most innovative part was to actually talk to people who were involved in integration, talk to arriving refugees, but also local receiving community members, because at that point integration has been very much seen as a problem of the arriving refugees, and very little attention being paid to the sharing of integration between arriving communities and receiving communities. And that's why I'm so excited about the Focus work, because Focus has absolutely, as Sabrina explained, been recognising the dynamic nature of integration, and that it is that interaction between arriving people who are already there, and of course all the institutions of society. So that was our approach, and we just move on with the next clip. I would say in that initial investigation of what was already known, there were two key ideas that I think have been really shaped us as we thought about dynamic integration. And one is the importance of identity and belonging. And for me, it first came across as I looked at the literature at the national level. And I think this is so relevant again today, and I hope we'll be able to talk about it, but like national identity, or how do we see ourselves as a nation? What are our criteria for belonging to our nation, our community? But I think we need to take that from the national level to the regional level, the local level, how identity it interacts with sense of belonging and inclusion and criteria for inclusion. So that's one key set of ideas that have been really important to me in dynamic integration. And then the other one comes from that body of literature which is looking at individual acculturation. And I wonder if we could go on to the next slide, because I wanted to just highlight the work of Berry, who looked at acculturation again a long time ago, and many of you will be familiar with this, but I think I've always found it really helpful in clarifying what we're talking about with integration and how that might differ from other forms of settlement in a new area. So Berry's insight from his studies of individuals was to say that there were two key dimensions. One is, are the relationships with wider society valued? So thinking with Berry's work, he was coming in, researching with individual people and finding out whether those individuals really valued their relationships with wider society, or whether those relationships weren't terribly important to them. And then we go on to the next dimension, and that is a dimension that concerns how much you value maintaining your own culture and identity. So you may value it a lot, and preserving your historic cultural identity is a really important priority for you, or you may not at all. So thanks, Christiane, if you could then add the other words on that screen, you can see that he was able, by using those dimensions, to identify different forms of acculturation or settling. So if you don't value relationships to wider society, but you do value maintaining your own cultural identity, that leads to a sort of a separation and a silo, cultural silo forming, where people from the same cultural background stick together, they don't mix with other people. If you don't value your culture and you don't value relationships, then you're quite isolated, you could be marginalized. And if you do value relationships with wider society, you want to mix and get to know people, but you don't value maintaining your own culture, and this is what is commonly understood as integration, I have to say, Berry would call that assimilation. And I think that's just a really important distinction in this whole debate, that often integration is talked about as what I would understand from Berry as being assimilation, that people are expected to build relationships with wider society and gradually let go of their own culture and identity. So the final quadrant is what Berry would label as integration, and what has really been very helpful in thinking about integration over the years, whereby people are able to value relationships and mix, but also maintain their culture and identity. And so Berry was very much talking from an individual perspective, but I think there's lots of interest and value to be gained by applying that to the collective perspective as well. But I just wanted to share that with you because I think it is key. So going on to the next slide, our own work, and this is where we link in with the great work of the Focus programme over the last 3.5 years, but our own work resulting from all these different strands of looking at literature, working with practitioners, doing field work, quantitative and qualitative, with both arriving refugees and receiving communities, led us to develop what we call the Indicators of Integration framework. And I should say, just out of interest for later conversations, it's called that because it was commissioned by government as a policy tool to give shape to how integration might be measured. So what government were looking for were indicators, so measures of outcome of integration. So we can maybe talk about that later, but it's an interesting task for an academic to be given. But what we did actually was, we said, because it's a chaotic concept, we need to have some sort of structure, some sort of conceptual framework for understanding what we mean by integration. And these domains represent the key domains that emerged from the research. And you'll see the top level is employment, housing, education, health, is actually labelled markers and means. And I think that is a key understanding which underpins this work, is also that although this is potentially was about markers, we recognise that that really the distinction between outcomes and process is meaningless in the integration sphere. That things such as gaining employment might be counted as markers, but actually gaining employment is also a means to developing your language skills, developing relationships, feeling safe and stable in your life, and so on. We recognised that social connection was absolutely central to most community members' understanding of integration, and that's not just the refugees, but also the receiving communities. We talked about their own integration, their own sense of belonging in the receiving communities, and people came up with a spectrum of types of relationships that were important to them, and we drew on social capital literature to crystallise them into social bridges between people with different backgrounds, social bonds within your group of people who feel they have the same background, and then social links, which are those vertical relationships with society and the institutions of society. And we found that quite a helpful way of looking at social relationships. And then facilitators were the key issues coming out of the research that enabled people to make progress in the other domains. Language and cultural knowledge, I'll talk a bit about that later, but was to recognise that in order to access a new society, you needed language skills, but you also need to understand how the culture works. Safety, a sense of feeling safe, but also stability, that you're not subject to enormous mobility. And then there, the foundation being around rights. And that was very interesting because it's a foundation in the sense of access and rights to participate in society. It is also a foundation in terms of attitudes between the receiving community and the arriving community, that actually shared rights was often mentioned as being the basis upon which people felt that they could build a life and have equitable relationships with people from different communities around them. So that's the original framework, and if we could just add the next few clicks, thank you. Just to make the point, as I say, that these are not distinct and independent domains, they are entirely interactive, and that, of course, the type of employment or your access to employment impacts on the kind of housing you have access to, and also vice versa, where you live influences employment. This in turn influences education. Education determines the kinds of social bonds that you form, and so on and so on. So the framework is not claiming to be a set of 10 distinct independent domains, but quite the opposite. It's trying to make sense of something that is very dynamic and very complex, and try to find ways of exploring some of that complexity. So just to whiz on, in terms of then, where have we gone since then in terms of dynamic integration research? My own work has really focused on the social connections level. So I wanted to go on to the next slide, and thank you, and just say that, and I'd be interested in other people's experience, but we found social connections is really hard to measure. I mean, there are measures of social capital and so on, but my interest has always been in trying to understand it from people's own perspectives, to have a grounded measure of social connection. So that's something we've been working on to develop a tool, and the illustration you see there, we have a mobile phone app to deliver a questionnaire, but then we develop a kind of a mapping for a local community of the people and organisations that a local community find valuable and important in their lives, and then we add a connection of how much they're connected to those people and organisations, and how much they trust them, and where there are opportunities for reciprocity. So that's something we've been working on over the past few years. And if we go on to the next slide, I couldn't be part of this event without mentioning big piece of work we've been doing with the British Red Cross, on collaborating with them on their family reunion service, and so they've been working with reuniting families to look at to support and look at integration, and some of the work coming out of that for us has been this sort of socio-ecological model of social connections, whereby the data very much was leading us along the direction of seeing how consolidating family relationships is a really key starting point for people in building a new life in a new place. And then people's perspective seems to move outward from there in concentric circles, not always in a linear fashion, of course, but there's definitely a pattern there of needing that consolidation of those close, trusted relationships, which enables people to build those ever-widening circles of relationships. So that's a piece of work that we've been doing. But let me go on to the next slide, because actually there's obviously a lot of research across the whole social research and economic research spectrum that is relevant to dynamic integration. And I'm not going to try and talk about all of that now, but I just thought it was probably worth flagging up the kinds of areas of research that I would suggest are really relevant to understanding dynamic integration. So there's been a lot of research on the integration of indicative integration domains, and particularly worth mentioning my colleagues in the UK, Jenny Phillimore, and then my colleague Linda Morris of Sussex University, Jenny of Birmingham University, really starting to explore those relationships and how one aspect of integration impacts on another. There's been lots of research on trauma and individual adjustment, and both in the humanitarian literature and also in mainstream therapeutic literature. I think that's all very, very relevant. Work in the humanitarian sector on mental health and psychosocial well-being has really contributed a lot in the last 20 years, and I'm particularly I find very helpful the work of Stephen Ogful and Derek Silo, both of whom look at what are the protective factors for mental health and psychosocial well-being when you're affected by conflict or disaster. And that really helps us to see both the importance of the stability of your environment and how undermining stability undermines community, and also the absolute core importance of social networks and social connections in protecting mental health and well-being. So there's work specifically on social networks, a lot of work on that, social cohesion, intergroup relations, the whole in-group, out-group idea, and intergroup contact, both of which I think have really shaped some of the focus work. And racism and discrimination, of course, is absolutely crucial in all of this, and I see as a particular example of in-group, out-group that is so key in our work on refugee integration so often. And perhaps, interesting as we look at different waves of migration and the experiences of different groups of people, so European to European transition versus other parts of the world to European, south to south migration, and so on. How does racism and discrimination play out in that? And social inclusion literature. So there's a lot, and they all provide a rich contribution. And I apologise for only mentioning them. I kind of feel pointers is all we've got time for. So just to update then on our own work on the indicators of integration, if we could go on to the next slide. So all this really rich work going on in interestingly about 2016, I think the UK Home Office decided they were actually interested in integration again, and realised a lot of work had been going on, and so they convened a 2-year consultancy process in the UK to look at that work and to see how the indicators of integration might be updated and adjusted, and particularly how the indicator side of it might be populated more fully, because it wasn't really populated very fully in the original work. So I'll just show you there are a few changes. Leisure has been added, and that has always come out strongly in certainly the qualitative work I've done, is how important leisure arenas are for building people's sense of belonging and their social relationships. And then we've changed culture or knowledge to culture, which I think is a really significant and important change, because we're looking then at dynamic integration more effectively, whereas I think the previous idea of cultural knowledge was a little bit more of an assimilation model, actually. So the culture and then digital skills have been added because they are mediating so much of people's access to society and one another and so on. And then citizenship and rights have become rights and responsibilities, which I can talk to you about the conversations around that with UK government. But it was very interesting, but we certainly recognise that we're interested in rights per se, not just citizenship, and rights and responsibilities go together. And so again, we come back to that dynamic integration concept. So the next slide shows the key principles. Now UK government policy would argue underpin integration, and these I know have been important in the focus work, so I'll just outline them to say integration is multidimensional. By that we mean there are all these different domains. You can't measure it with one dimension, as it sometimes happens with employment as being a single dimension. It does not reflect integration. It's multidirectional, it's dynamic, it's between people and institutions, but actually also it's multidirectional in the sense it doesn't always progress in one direction. It's not always an onward and upward path. It's a shared responsibility. Responsibility for that dynamic change is shared between all parties. And finally, it's context specific. Because of all those other things, we can see how it's going to look different in different contexts. And measurement must be context specific if we're to really grasp integration. So on to the next slide, just to let you know, and then a couple of extra clicks, I think, if you would, Christian, just to let you know that there is an online toolkit, and that provides, if you stab those next two pieces, thanks. That provides access to the indicators, which is very much more comprehensive, and other resources like a handbook on theory of change and also of good practice. So there are resonances with the work of Focus Again. So that's available online. Okay, so I just want to finish by reflecting now on dynamic integration overall, where we've come, where we've been, and I suppose for me the key question is whose agenda is dynamic integration? I think for a lot of the time I've worked in integration, there have been assumptions, unacknowledged assumptions that integration is the goal, it's a good thing, and it's all about social cohesion. Now that I'm not disagreeing with that, but I'm also recognising that is a policymaker's perspective. So I think it's really helpful to ask these key questions. So on what basis do we welcome people into our societies? And I would argue that generally, I'll come on to the next bit in a minute, but that generally that's on the basis of compassion if we're talking about refugees. I was mentioning earlier that we are currently welcoming, quite rightly, Ukrainians in, and there's a lot of compassion, there's a lot of desire to welcome, and that's really important and really helpful. But it is a charity model. It is a model based on the assumption of vulnerability. And as we've seen over the years, that doesn't last. So if we go on to the next arrow, thank you, and the next box, it's not enough to have that welcoming charity model. It doesn't last. People start to have compassion fatigue, as we talk about, but also actually for those who've arrived, it's not enough to be welcomed. The people who've arrived, if they're going to stay, need to be included. They need to be able to live their own lives and flourish. So I think that's where we need to ask, on what basis do we include people? Not just on the basis of our compassion boarding, because that won't lead to inclusion. So that's where we look at national identity, local identity, sense of belonging, and so on. And unfortunately, we commonly see the problematisation of refugees, or we see racism and discrimination and so on. So it's absolutely crucial that we address the inclusion. But I just want to add another dimension, which is, if we add the next click, which is that actually also, on what basis do we plan our long-term strategy? Because we have this neat little idea, people arrive, they want to settle, we invest in them, they settle, and they contribute to our society. But actually, whose agenda is that? And if you click on the next arrow, we know that migration is often, people return. We don't know that people are going to settle. In many places, and some of those in this study, like Croatia, and Jordan, the issue is that the country is seen as a transition place, not a settling place. So how do we design policy in relation to that? Although that changes, and back to dynamism, back to dynamic integration, people's intentions in arriving generally do change, and people sometimes settle when they don't intend to, or move on when they had intended to settle. So if we go on to the next arrows, I'm really just trying to say that if we're looking at dynamic integration, we need to recognize all these dynamics and the cyclical nature of migration, and the ongoing fluidity and flexibility, which of course makes it very complex to understand and very complex to so I just want to leave you with the big question that I'm currently grappling with. We dream of a lovely dynamic integration process where everybody mixes, values each other, everyone's able to make their own choices and flourish in their own ways, and recognize diversity. The challenge really is, when you look at the realities of experience, is, to me anyway, is to what extent is it possible to build solidarity, that sense of belonging, shared commitment, whilst also celebrating diversity. Solidarity and diversity are really challenging bedfellows, so that to me is the big challenge that we face. So I think it's fantastic to have been part of the Focus programme, and I've deliberately not talked too much about it because I know we're going to hear about it, and I think it's making a really significant contribution to this whole area of debate and understanding. So thank you, Focus team, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alison. A lot of food for thought, and I'm sure your points and questions will resonate throughout this 1.5 days. Now, is there any burning question from the audience here and remote audience?
Can we get the mic?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Very interesting, and so sad that you couldn't make it today. I think I'm part of your fan club after 3.5 years of Focus. If there isn't a fan club, I think I'm the new chair. Talking about your work all the time in the Focus project, not just the indicators in the creation framework, but all the research that came after it as well, or in between the different versions. And I'm wondering if you've seen our latest update to your framework, where we added trust and reciprocity as a 6th facilitator to the framework based on your own research suggestions. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about this, the research, where this came from, and if you agree it should be added as a 6th facilitator, as this was your own suggestion.
Thank you, Anouk. I missed some of the sound at the beginning of that, but I did hear you asking about adding reciprocity to the framework. Yeah?
Yes, trust and reciprocity. Yeah.
Trust and reciprocity, yes, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I find that really helpful, because I suppose, as you say, that's something that I've been interested in. In a way, to me, it's always been embedded in the framework because, as you know, the social connections were elaborated according to social capital theory, and social capital theory would lead us to look at the quality of relationships. And I think that's really helpful and really interesting in some of the other work that we'll probably be talking about later. To look at the quality of relationships is so important in understanding integration. And reciprocity, particularly, was something that came out very powerfully to me in some of my studies amongst refugees and asylum seekers in Scotland. And really, it came out to me because people were just so lacking in opportunities for reciprocity. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the opposite side of the dynamic. So when we think about a lack of dynamic integration, I think we're tending to think of a lack of flexibility in receiving institutions or a lack of engagement by receiving communities. So it's a one-way thing. It's all about the refugees having to make the effort. So that's a failure of dynamic integration, but actually also lack of opportunity for reciprocity, in my view, is a failure of opportunity for dynamic integration, because it's treating the arriving communities as vulnerable and only able to receive benefit rather than be able to contribute. And unless people are able to contribute, we know that you can't build strong social connections. And trust, similarly, I found that very interesting, and as you saw, I built that into my own work, exploring social connections, because I've seen how valuable that is to understand not only who people have contact with, but the extent to which they trust them. And I know that's really reflected in the focus work around the really interesting work on people's attitudes to one another. I mean, again, trust is a hugely complex area, and so exploring trust in what regard is something that I guess we need to dig deeper into as well. So I welcome both of those. Thanks, Annika.
Thanks a lot for this question, and for Alison for raising this point about the quality of relationships too. It's not any social mixing which works. It's important, the quality and meaningful relationships. And how you build meaningful relationships is trust, is reciprocity, and we will discuss a lot about this afternoon. Any other question?
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. As you describe integration, one thing, I'm still thinking about integration as a shared responsibility. And my question is, okay, how the responsibility can be shared in front of the fact that the structural preconditions are not equal. How, for example, in Germany, we have 10 million people in Germany, adults, who are not allowed to vote. So they're excluded from basic democratic rights, or in the area of public health, like the refugees. Most of them are excluded by the German law from equal access to medical treatment. And my question is, how can the responsibility be shared when people don't have access to basic, even human rights? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I think your point really illustrates how important that access to rights is on so many levels, in terms of the direct receiving of services, but moreover in terms of participation and dynamic integration itself. And I guess this is the really interesting thing that the focus research, which we're going to hear about, has teased out, but there's obviously more to be done, and that's around how does access to rights impact on the ethos of society and people's attitudes, because it is in itself an interactive relationship, isn't it? And I think if our politicians are not granting access to these basic human rights to newcomers, it's reflecting a certain model of integration, a certain attitude to the newcomers, which to some extent is fed by popular opinions, but of course there's that symbiotic relationship in that government narratives and other media narratives shape public opinion, and we have these predominant narratives around problematizing refugees in particular and migrants in general. So I guess that's where I'm thinking when I put up that illustration of the kind of welcome versus the long-term inclusion, because I think we're just far too short-term in our policy making. So we're not investing in the long-term inclusion. And, you know, I must admit, I felt very sad as I watched the whole kind of Syrian resettlement rollout in different European countries that, you know, there was a big welcome, but I was watching and seeing there wasn't the investment in integration and inclusion, and inevitably it wasn't very long before we were hearing stories of migrants causing trouble and the criminalization of migrants and so on. And to me, that is a symptom of this short-term popularist policy response, rather than actually taking the evidence, which is that inward migration and migration generally between international borders is generally good for the economy. Now, if we could have more profile given to those kind of pieces of big socioeconomic research, and for that to be our headline, then I would have some more hope that actually people's rights would be built in from day one, which would in turn actually speed up and improve the quality of integration and building of social relationships and the economic benefits of having inward migration.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, let's delve into the